What if the most terrifying warning before a tragedy didn't come from police, didn't come from doctors, didn't come from court records? What if it came from a friend? And not just any friend. A man whose entire career was built on laughter. A man who made generations laugh so hard they forgot their own fears. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What if that man leaned in close, lowered his voice, and said something that was never meant to be repeated? Rob, this ends in tears. Or blood. Let that sit for a moment. Because if that sentence was ever truly spoken, whether whispered, hinted, or remembered after the fact, then it reframes everything that came next. Not as a sudden shock, not as a random tragedy, but as a slow-motion collision that someone, somewhere, believed was already in motion. And that's where this story begins. Not with headlines, not with sirens, not with a courtroom sketch, but with a warning no one outside a private circle was ever supposed to hear. A warning allegedly tied to Mel Brooks and his longtime friend Rob Reiner. Two men linked not just by Hollywood, but by decades of shared history, shared success, and shared silence. Ask yourself this. How many warnings do we dismiss because they sound too dramatic, too emotional, too extreme, too uncomfortable? We laugh them off. We minimize them. We tell ourselves people are overreacting. Until one day, we're forced to look back and wonder, what if they weren't? This story matters now because it isn't really about fame. It isn't really about Hollywood. And it isn't really about one night. It's about something far more familiar. Family pressure, legacy, expectation, guilt, and the quiet, corrosive belief that love alone can fix what's breaking underneath. Let's pull back for a moment. Because to understand why a warning like that would even exist, you have to understand the world it came from. Rob Reiner didn't just grow up around greatness. He was born into it. A family name that carried weight long before his own achievements stacked up. A household where creativity wasn't optional, it was oxygen. Where success wasn't celebrated once, it was expected again and again. And on the outside, it looked perfect. Awards, applause, legacy. But inside, legacy can feel like a debt you never finish paying. Here's the uncomfortable truth we rarely talk about. Fame doesn't just elevate families. It distorts them. It changes the rules of love. It changes the meaning of failure. It changes what support looks like and what it costs. And when someone in that orbit struggles, really struggles, the instinct isn't always to confront it head-on. Sometimes the instinct is to protect the image, to soften the edges, to explain things away, to say, it'll pass. But what if it doesn't? That's the tension at the center of this story. Not a single villain, not a single hero, just people making human decisions under inhuman pressure. Now think about Mel Brooks for a moment. To the world, he's laughter, timing, absurdity, joy weaponized against despair. But behind closed doors, behind the curtain of performance, he's also someone who's lived long enough to recognize patterns. Patterns of burnout, patterns of resentment, patterns of people cracking quietly while everyone else applauds. So when a warning like this is rumored to exist, when people say Mel allegedly pulled Rob aside and spoke in tones stripped of humor, it forces a terrifying question. What did he see? Was it something in Rob himself? Was it something happening inside the family? Or was it the kind of slow unraveling that only shows itself to people who've already lived through enough loss to recognize the signs? Here's where the story tightens. Because according to the narrative that later emerged, the Reiner household wasn't just dealing with success. It was dealing with expectation without escape. One family member, in particular, struggled to define himself outside a towering name and an even longer shadow. Imagine growing up where your last name opens doors, but also locks you into comparison. Every failure feels louder. Every misstep feels public. Every identity you try on feels borrowed. And if you don't know who you are, if you don't believe you're enough on your own, that confusion can turn into anger. Anger can turn into resentment. Resentment can turn inward or outward. Now pause. I want to ask you something directly. How many families do you know where love exists, but understanding doesn't? Where support is offered, but the wound sits somewhere deeper? Where parents give everything they have and still feel like it isn't enough? That's why this story hits so hard. Because strip away the fame, and what's left is painfully recognizable. Parents carrying guilt they don't know how to put down. A child searching for identity and feeling like a disappointment just for existing. A household where everyone is trying to help, but no one agrees on what help even looks like. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a warning, a line drawn in the sand. Tears or blood. Why those words? Why not heartbreak? Why not loss? Why something so final? That's the question that refuses to let this story rest. Because if someone truly believed things could end violently, emotionally or otherwise, then that belief didn't come from nowhere. It came from accumulation. Moments stacked on moments. Conversations left unresolved. Behavior normalized because confronting it felt too painful. This is where hindsight becomes dangerous. Because after tragedy, everything looks obvious. Every red flag glows brighter. Every warning sounds louder. Every silence feels intentional. But before it's all noise. People convince themselves tomorrow will be calmer, that the next conversation will fix it, that love will eventually overpower chaos. And sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. This story matters now because it forces us to confront a truth we'd rather avoid. Not every tragedy announces itself with sirens. Some arrive quietly, disguised as tension, as denial, as hope stretched just a little too thin. And when the worst finally happens, we rush to ask how. But the better question is often, how long? How long was this building? How long did people feel something was wrong, but didn't know what to do? How long did everyone assume someone else would step in? That's why the alleged warning carries such weight. Because warnings are only powerful if someone listens. And if no one does, they become ghosts, haunting every memory that follows. As we move forward in this story, we're going to peel back layers slowly. Not to accuse, not to sensationalize, but to understand. We'll look at legacy and resentment, at guilt and protection, at the dangerous space between help and enabling. And we'll return again and again to that sentence. Rob, this ends in tears. Or blood. Because the closer you look, the more unsettling the question becomes. Was it a warning about fate? Or a warning about choices? And if someone saw the ending coming, why couldn't it be stopped? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Use short, punchy lines for tension, longer ones for storytelling. Ask direct questions to the audience. What kind of warning makes a room go quiet? Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind meant for attention. The kind that lands heavy. The kind that doesn't ask for agreement. The kind that sounds less like advice and more like recognition. Here's the question that hangs over everything that follows. What does a man known for laughter say when he stops joking? Because if you believe the whispers that surfaced later, that's exactly what happened between Mel Brooks and Rob Reiner. No cameras, no audience, no punchline. Just two men who had known each other long enough to drop the masks. Imagine the setting. Not a boardroom, not a stage. Something quieter. A pause between conversations. A moment after laughter fades. And then, a shift. You've felt it before, haven't you? That moment when someone you trust stops speaking casually and starts speaking carefully. When every word feels chosen. Measured. Heavy. That's how the warning is often described in retellings. Not shouted. Not emotional. Controlled. Which makes it more disturbing. Because controlled fear is rarely impulsive. It's accumulated. Built from observation. From patterns that don't go away. So what pattern could possibly push someone like Mel to say something so stark? To use words like tears or blood. Let's slow this down. Mel Brooks had spent decades watching people. Not just performing with them, but watching them crack. Behind the scenes. Behind the laughter. Behind the success. Comedy, ironically, puts you front row for human breakdown. You see how pressure hides behind jokes. You see how applause can drown out pain. You see how people use humor to survive things they never process. And Mel had lived long enough to understand one brutal truth. When someone is spiraling, the signs don't show up all at once. They arrive in fragments. Mood shifts. Isolation. Resentment disguised as sarcasm. Silence where there used to be warmth. Nothing dramatic enough to call the police. Nothing obvious enough to stage an intervention. Just wrongness. A feeling you can't quite name. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. How many times have you sensed something was off with someone you love, but talked yourself out of it? How many times did you say, "It's probably nothing"? That's where warnings die. Not in confrontation. In minimization. According to the fictionalized narrative surrounding this story, Mel wasn't reacting to a single incident. He was reacting to trajectory, a direction. And trajectories are dangerous because they don't feel urgent until they are. This wasn't about one argument or one bad night. It was about the weight pressing down on a family that had spent decades pretending weight didn't exist. Let's talk about Rob for a moment. From the outside, Rob Reiner's life looked like proof that legacy could be earned, not just inherited. He wasn't just Carl Reiner's son. He became his own force, his own voice, his own success. But here's the contradiction no one likes to explore. When you succeed under a legendary name, you don't escape the shadow. You extend it. Your success raises expectations for everyone connected to you. And if someone close to you can't meet those expectations, the comparison becomes unbearable. This is where family dynamics get dangerous. Not abusive, not malicious, just relentlessly pressurized. Imagine being the person in the room who feels like the only one not moving forward. Imagine watching your family collect achievements while you collect frustration. Imagine believing, quietly, that love is conditional on performance. Now add something else. Guilt. Because Rob and Michelle, in this story, are often described as parents who cared deeply, who tried, who helped, who stayed involved, which makes everything more complicated. Because when love exists, denial becomes easier. You don't want to believe someone you love could be unraveling. You want to believe time will fix it. Opportunity will fix it. Another chance will fix it. And here's where Mel's role becomes crucial. He wasn't inside the household. He wasn't bound by daily routines. He had distance. Perspective. Distance is dangerous too, but sometimes it's the only thing that lets you see the whole picture. Think about the people who warn you in life. They're rarely the ones closest to the problem. They're the ones standing just far enough away to notice patterns. So when Mel allegedly spoke, he wasn't speaking as a comic. He was speaking as someone who had watched similar stories end badly before. Different names, different families. Same structure, pressure, expectation, resentment, silence. Here's the chilling part. The warning wasn't followed by action. At least, not the kind that would change the course. No public confrontation. No explosive fallout. Life went on, which tells us something important. Rob didn't dismiss the warning, but he didn't fully act on it either. Why? Because when someone tells you something terrifying, your instinct isn't always to accept it. It's to rationalize it. He's worried. He's being dramatic. He doesn't see the whole picture. And if you're Rob Reiner, someone used to managing crises, narratives, and public pressure, you might believe you can handle it. You might believe love will stabilize things. You might believe the worst-case scenario is impossible. Let me ask you this. How often do we ignore warnings because accepting them would mean admitting we're out of control? Because warnings threaten the illusion that we're managing everything just fine. And that illusion is seductive, especially in families where strength is a public identity. This chapter isn't about blame. It's about timing. Because warnings only matter before outcomes. Afterward, they become evidence. And hindsight turns compassion into accusation. But in the moment, everything feels negotiable. Let's talk about the phrase itself. Tears, or blood. Why that contrast? Tears represent emotional devastation. Blood represents something irreversible, physical, final. The fact that both were mentioned suggests a spectrum, as if the path could end in heartbreak or something far worse. And that's terrifying, because it implies escalation. It implies that things weren't static. They were moving, building, changing shape. And if someone perceived that change, it means there were signs. Not obvious ones, but enough to set off alarm bells in someone who'd lived long enough to trust instinct. Mel Brooks had lost friends, lost collaborators, lost people to addiction, despair, silence. He knew how fast things could turn. So imagine him watching from the outside, watching conversations soften instead of sharpen, watching hope replace intervention, watching a family try to love their way through something that might require confrontation. That's where warnings come from. Not fear of the unknown, fear of repetition, fear of a story you've seen before ending the same way again. Here's another uncomfortable question. What if the warning wasn't about a person at all? What if it was about a dynamic? Because individuals don't implode in isolation. They implode inside systems, families, expectations, patterns, and systems resist change. They prefer familiarity, even when familiarity is harmful. So when Mel spoke, He may have been warning Rob not about one individual, but about the environment that allowed pressure to keep building unchecked, about the cost of carrying guilt instead of boundaries, about the danger of mistaking patience for progress. And here's where the story tightens again, because after the warning, nothing visibly changed, which suggests either the warning wasn't taken seriously, or it was taken seriously, but no one knew what to do next. And that's often worse, because knowing something is wrong without knowing how to fix it creates paralysis. You delay, you wait, you hope, until waiting becomes the most dangerous choice of all. This is the moment where many stories turn, where someone intervenes, where boundaries are drawn, where consequences are enforced. But this story didn't turn there. It drifted, and drift is invisible until you hit something solid. As we move into the next chapter, we're going to widen the lens. Because to understand why the warning didn't change the outcome, you have to understand the family history that shaped every response afterward. A legacy built on brilliance, a name that opened doors and closed emotional escape routes, a pressure cooker disguised as success, and a resentment that didn't announce itself loudly enough to stop what was coming. Because the warning may have been spoken in private, but the forces behind it had been building for years. And once they reached a certain point, no one, not even someone who saw it coming, could stop the collision. But what came next would reveal how deep that legacy ran, and why escaping it was never as simple as walking away. What happens when success stops being a blessing and starts feeling like a burden? That's the question we have to ask before anything else. Because if you want to understand why a warning like the one Mel allegedly gave Rob could exist at all, you have to understand the invisible weight that comes with a legendary name. A weight that doesn't show up in headlines. A weight that doesn't care how much love is in the room. A weight that presses quietly, day after day, until even breathing feels like performance. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to admit. Legacy isn't neutral. It shapes behavior. It shapes expectations. It shapes silence. And in families where legacy is everywhere, silence can become the loudest thing of all. The Reiner name wasn't just known. It was revered. Decades before Rob ever directed a film, before his voice became recognizable, before his influence solidified, there was already a towering presence setting the standard. Carl Reiner. To the world, Carl was brilliance with warmth, sharp wit wrapped in kindness, a man who made comedy feel effortless. But inside a family, even the kindest genius casts a shadow. And shadows don't mean malice. They mean comparison. They mean expectation without instruction. They mean growing up knowing the bar isn't just high. It's already been cleared by someone you love. Now pause for a second. Imagine being born into that. Every dinner conversation orbiting creativity. Every family gathering touched by brilliance. Every failure, no matter how small, feeling magnified. And here's where things get complicated. Rob didn't crumble under that shadow. He rose. He built a career that proved he belonged. Which sounds like a success story. And it is. But success inside a legacy doesn't relieve pressure. It redistributes it. Because when one generation proves greatness is possible again, the expectation doesn't disappear. It multiplies. Suddenly, everyone connected to that legacy feels the heat. And for those who struggle to find their footing, the pressure doesn't inspire. It suffocates. This is where family dynamics quietly fracture. Not with shouting, not with abuse, but with unspoken rules. Don't embarrass the name. Don't air problems publicly. Don't fail loudly. Those rules aren't written down. They're absorbed. And once absorbed, they shape how problems are handled or avoided. Here's the contradiction that sits at the heart of this story. A family built on humor can struggle with emotional honesty. Because humor smooths things over, deflects tension, turns discomfort into something manageable. Laughter becomes a release valve. But when laughter is the default, pain can feel like an interruption. Something to be redirected instead of confronted. Think about it. How many times have you laughed your way out of a serious conversation? How many times have you said, "We'll deal with it later," just to keep the mood light? Now imagine that scaled up over decades. In a family where laughter isn't just a coping mechanism, it's the brand. So when cracks start to form, when someone in that orbit begins to unravel, the instinct isn't confrontation. It's containment. Let's keep things calm. Let's keep things private. Let's protect what we've built. That instinct doesn't come from selfishness. It comes from fear. Fear of loss. Fear of failure. Fear of being the family. The belief that time and opportunity would heal what pressure kept reopening. And here's the cruel irony. The more the family tried to help, the harder it became to draw boundaries. Because boundaries feel like abandonment when guilt is already in the room. So instead of saying no, they said later. Instead of saying stop, they said slow down. Instead of saying this can't continue, they said we'll figure it out. And that belief, that everything could still be figured out, became the foundation of denial. Ask yourself something. How many times have you delayed a hard decision because you hoped the problem would resolve itself? How many times did you choose peace now over safety later? That choice doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. But when it's repeated inside a pressure cooker, it becomes dangerous. By the time Mel's warning allegedly surfaced, the groundwork had already been laid. Years of expectations without clarity. Years of love without limits. Years of silence disguised as patience. The warning wasn't introducing a problem. It was naming one. And naming something doesn't mean you know how to stop it. That's the tragedy here. Not that no one cared, but that caring alone wasn't enough. As we move into the next chapter, the focus tightens. Because now we shift from family systems to one individual caught inside them. A person trying to define himself in a house built on greatness. A person who didn't feel like he belonged anywhere else. A person whose struggle wasn't just about rebellion, but about identity itself. Because when you don't know who you are, you don't just lose direction, you lose restraint. And that's where the story begins to turn darker. But what came next would reveal just how heavy that legacy really was, and why escaping it felt impossible for the one person who needed escape the most. What happens when you grow up surrounded by greatness, but can't find yourself anywhere inside it? That question sits at the center of this chapter. Because before there were accusations, before there were headlines, before there were whispered warnings, there was a young man trying to answer something far more basic. Who am I if I'm not them? And if you've never lived inside a famous family, it's easy to misunderstand how brutal that question can become. From the outside, it looks like privilege, opportunity, access, safety nets everywhere. But from the inside, it can feel like suffocation. Because when a name precedes you into every room, your identity doesn't arrive blank. It arrives pre-written. Expectations already attached. Comparisons already made. Judgments already waiting. And according to the fictionalized narrative that later emerged, that pressure weighed heavily on Nick Reiner from a young age. Not because he lacked talent. Not because he lacked opportunity. But because he lacked something far harder to manufacture. A sense of self that didn't feel borrowed. Imagine growing up knowing exactly who your father is to the world. Imagine knowing exactly who your grandfather is to history. And then imagine standing in front of a mirror and realizing you don't know who you are at all. That confusion doesn't stay neutral. It demands resolution. And when healthy identity building feels out of reach, people reach for extremes. They rebel. They provoke. They self-destruct. Not always because they want to, but because chaos feels better than invisibility. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because it's tempting to flatten people into roles. The troubled son, the entitled heir, the problem child. Those labels make stories easier to digest, but they erase the slow erosion that happens long before behavior becomes visible. In this narrative, Nick wasn't born angry. He became angry. Anger became a substitute for identity. Because anger does something powerful. It draws boundaries. It says, I am not you. Even if the cost is isolation. Even if the cost is self-destruction. And here's the contradiction no one likes to confront. Sometimes rebellion isn't about rejecting your family. It's about begging them to see you as separate. Now let's talk about expectation. According to family source-style accounts that circulated later, Nick was often described as wanting the rewards of connection without the grind of building something independently. But ask yourself this. What does independently even mean when your last name opens every door? When every attempt to step outside the shadow is still defined by it? You don't get to fail quietly. You don't get to experiment anonymously. Every misstep feels like confirmation that you don't belong. So instead of gradual growth, pressure accelerates everything. Failure feels final. Success feels stolen. And effort feels pointless when comparison is unavoidable. This is how entitlement narratives form. Not always from arrogance, sometimes from despair. Because if you believe you'll never measure up no matter how hard you try, effort starts to feel like humiliation. And humiliation breeds resentment. Resentment breeds withdrawal. Withdrawal breeds isolation. And isolation is where dangerous thoughts grow unchecked. Now pause here. Think about how many people you know who are angry, not because they think they're better than everyone else, but because they believe they'll never be enough. That belief corrodes from the inside. And in this story, that corrosion didn't happen overnight. It built slowly. Years of feeling like the odd piece in a perfectly crafted machine. Years of watching praise flow around you instead of toward you. Years of questioning whether love is unconditional or quietly transactional. Did they love me or what I represent? That question haunts people far longer than critics ever could. According to past interviews referenced in this fictionalized arc, Nick himself once spoke about struggling with identity, saying fame informs who you are. That line matters, because it suggests identity wasn't something he felt free to discover. It was something imposed. And when identity is imposed, rebellion becomes inevitable. You either become the person everyone expects, or you become the person who disrupts the narrative entirely. And disruption often looks ugly, angry, self-destructive, unpredictable, which brings us to the idea of persona. In this story, Nick's rebellious phase is often described as an adopted persona. Drug-addicted, defiant, provocative. But personas are masks. They protect something underneath. And underneath this one was insecurity so deep it couldn't risk vulnerability. Because vulnerability requires safety. And safety is hard to feel when you believe disappointment is inevitable. So instead of disappointing quietly, you disappoint loudly. At least then, you control the narrative. That's the paradox of self-sabotage. It gives you power over how you fall. Now let's bring Rob and Michelle back into the picture. Because here's where guilt and love collide. Parents don't see personas the way outsiders do. They see the child underneath. The one who laughed at the dinner table. The one who needed reassurance. The one they remember before the anger. So when signs of struggle appear, their instinct isn't discipline. It's protection. Intervention wrapped in compassion. Opportunity framed as rescue. And in this narrative, Rob and Michelle reportedly carried enormous guilt. Guilt that they hadn't done enough. Guilt that success somehow came at a cost to their child. Guilt that maybe the shadow they lived in was too long. So they tried something bold. They tried collaboration. In 2015, they worked with Nick on the film Being Charlie. On paper, it looked like opportunity. A chance to build confidence. A chance to prove capability. A chance to create something meaningful together. But beneath the surface, it was something else too. A lifeline. A way to anchor identity to purpose. And that's where intentions and outcomes can diverge. Because collaboration can empower, or it can reinforce dependency. And if identity is already fragile, tying it to family approval can deepen the wound. Success becomes proof of worth. Failure becomes confirmation of fear. Now imagine the pressure of that. Not just making a film, but proving you deserve your place in the family narrative. Proving you're not just tolerated. Proving you're not the weak link. That kind of pressure doesn't motivate everyone. For some, it paralyzes. For others, it inflames resentment. And resentment doesn't always point outward. Sometimes it turns inward first. Self-loathing disguised as bravado. Defiance hiding desperation. This is where outside observers often get it wrong. They see anger and assume entitlement. They see rebellion and assume arrogance. But beneath those behaviors is often something far more fragile. Fear. Fear of being exposed as inadequate. Fear of confirming everyone's worst suspicions. Fear that no matter what you do, you'll always be Rob Reiner's son. Never just yourself. Now let's return to Mel's warning for a moment. Viewed through this lens, the warning takes on new weight. Because it wasn't just about conflict. It was about identity collapse. People who lose their sense of self don't implode gently. They oscillate. Between hope and rage. Between gratitude and bitterness. Between wanting help and rejecting it violently. That oscillation exhausts everyone involved. Parents feel helpless. Friends feel uncertain. Outsiders feel judgmental. And the person at the center feels trapped. Trapped by expectations they didn't choose. Trapped by opportunities that feel conditional. Trapped by a family that loves them but doesn't know how to reach them. This is where silence becomes deadly. Because hard conversations keep getting postponed. We'll talk about it later. He needs time. She's just acting out. Later never comes. Time doesn't heal identity wounds. It deepens them. As this chapter closes, it's important to understand something. Nothing in this story suggests inevitability. Identity struggles don't doom anyone. Rebellion doesn't equal violence. Anger doesn't mean tragedy. But unresolved pressure, unacknowledged resentment, guilt replacing boundaries, those things build momentum. And momentum doesn't care about intentions. It only cares about direction. In the next chapter, we're going to confront a narrative that emerged later and made people deeply uncomfortable. The idea that this wasn't just about pain, but about expectation without effort. About believing you were owed something the world never promised. And about how resentment can quietly transform into something far more dangerous when entitlement and despair collide. Because the most volatile mix isn't arrogance alone. It's arrogance fused with hopelessness. And once that fuse is lit, no one, not even the people who love you most, can predict where the explosion will land. But what came next would expose a belief that changed how everyone saw the situation. And raised a question no family ever wants to answer. What if the most dangerous belief isn't, I deserve everything, but nothing I do will ever be enough? That's the fault line this chapter sits on. Because somewhere along the way, a narrative took hold, inside the family, among friends, and later in whispers beyond it, that one person wanted the rewards without the work. Entitlement. It's a word that lands hard. It implies arrogance. It implies laziness. It implies contempt for effort. But here's the uncomfortable question we have to ask before we accept that label. What if entitlement wasn't the cause? What if it was the symptom? Let's slow this down. In families shaped by legacy, effort is rarely measured the same way it is elsewhere. For most people, effort means building something from scratch. Failure happens in private. Progress is incremental. But in a famous family, effort is constantly compared to achievements already etched into history. You're not just working. You're measuring yourself against a standard that was set long before you ever had a say. So when someone appears to want results without process, it's tempting to assume arrogance. But sometimes it's resignation. Because if you believe, deep down, that no amount of work will ever close the gap, why exhaust yourself trying? That belief is corrosive. And in this story, it quietly reshaped how behavior was interpreted. On the surface, frustration looked like entitlement. Expectations sounded unrealistic. Anger sounded ungrateful. But beneath that surface was a more fragile truth. A person who didn't believe the rules applied to him, because he didn't believe the rules could ever work for him. That's not confidence. That's collapse. Now let's talk about effort. According to accounts that circulated later, there was tension around the idea of putting in the work. But work toward what? A career that would always be compared to someone else's? A path that would always be framed as handed, not earned? Imagine trying to build motivation in an environment where success feels pre-labeled as nepotism and failure feels like proof of inadequacy. That's not a neutral starting point. That's a trap. So when effort stalls, it's easy to say the person didn't want to work. It's harder to ask whether they believed work mattered. Here's where family dynamics complicate everything. Rob and Michelle, in this narrative, are often described as parents who wanted to help, desperately. They didn't withdraw support. They didn't sever ties. They tried to provide structure. But structure without autonomy can feel like control. And control breeds resentment, especially when guilt is in the room. Because guilt changes how boundaries are enforced. Consequences soften. Expectations blur. Rules bend. Not because parents don't care, but because they care too much to risk pushing someone away. Ask yourself something. Have you ever held back from enforcing a boundary because you were afraid of what might happen if you did? That fear doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. But repeated over time, it teaches a dangerous lesson. That boundaries are negotiable. And once boundaries become negotiable, resentment starts to flow in both directions. Parents feel unappreciated. Children feel controlled. Everyone feels misunderstood. Now add expectation back into the mix. If someone grows up believing love is tied to success, even subtly, that belief creates a warped incentive system. You don't work to grow. You work to prove. And proving is exhausting. Eventually, exhaustion turns into defiance. Why keep trying if the verdict feels pre-written? This is how entitlement narratives harden. Observers see anger and conclude arrogance. They don't see the years of quiet defeat that came first. And here's where contradictions pile up. Because at the same time entitlement was whispered, guilt was acknowledged. Parents reportedly felt responsible. Responsible for the shadow. Responsible for the pressure. Responsible for the instability. Those two narratives, entitlement and guilt, cannot comfortably coexist. If someone is truly entitled, why feel guilt? And if guilt exists, what does it say about the system that produced the behavior? This contradiction is crucial because it reveals uncertainty. No one really knew how to interpret what was happening. They were guessing, reacting, trying to read signs without a map. And in that uncertainty, the worst-case scenario didn't feel real enough to justify drastic action. That's how families stall. They live in the gray. Now consider how this plays out emotionally. From the outside, it looks like someone asking for more than they deserve. From the inside, it feels like someone asking for recognition they've never received. Those two perspectives talk past each other. And when communication breaks down, behavior fills the gap. Behavior becomes language. Anger becomes a message. Withdrawal becomes a statement. Provocation becomes proof of existence. That's why people act out. Not because they don't care, but because they don't feel heard. Now let's revisit the warning again. Tears or blood. If Mel allegedly saw entitlement as the issue, the warning would have sounded different. It would have been moral, judgmental. It wasn't. It was ominous, which suggests fear, not condemnation. Fear of escalation. Fear that the emotional environment had become unstable enough that consequences could no longer be predicted. That fear doesn't come from arrogance alone. It comes from volatility, from oscillation, from someone swinging between dependence and defiance, between wanting support and resenting it, between feeling owed and feeling abandoned. That swing is dangerous because it means no response feels right. Help feels smothering. Distance feels rejection. And everyone involved starts walking on eggshells. Eggshells break. Quietly. Now let's address the phrase that keeps resurfacing. Wanted a life that didn't exist. On its face, it sounds damning. But think about what it really means. A life without comparison. A life without legacy pressure. A life where effort leads to proportional reward. That life does exist, just not inside certain systems. And when someone realizes the system they're trapped in can't give them what they need, desperation sets in. Desperation can look like entitlement, but it feels like suffocation. This is where resentment transforms. It stops being passive. It starts to sharpen, not into violence, but into bitterness. Bitterness toward expectations. Bitterness toward narratives. Bitterness toward people who have it together. And bitterness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind sarcasm. Sometimes behind withdrawal. Sometimes behind explosive moments that seem to come out of nowhere. Those moments don't come from nowhere. They come from pressure that finally exceeds containment. As this chapter closes, we're left with an unsettling reality. No one could agree on what the problem really was. Entitlement? Desperation? Identity collapse? All of the above? And when diagnosis is unclear, treatment becomes guesswork. Guesswork delays intervention. Delay allows momentum. And momentum doesn't need permission. In the next chapter, we're going to look at a decision that was meant to fix everything. A collaboration framed as healing. A project meant to restore confidence and purpose. But sometimes, the thing meant to save a situation locks everyone into it even deeper. Because when hope is placed on a single outcome, failure becomes catastrophic. But what came next would reveal how even the best intentions can deepen the very wounds they're trying to heal, and why the line between help and harm is thinner than anyone realized. What if the thing meant to save someone actually made everything heavier? That's the question this chapter refuses to let go. Because when families are desperate for solutions, they often cling to projects. Something tangible, something hopeful, something that feels like progress. And in this story, that project had a name. A film. A collaboration. A moment where art, family, and healing were supposed to intersect. On the surface, it looked like opportunity. But beneath the surface, it carried a weight no one fully acknowledged at the time. Let's begin with the intention. The intention matters. According to the narrative that later formed, Rob and Michelle weren't trying to exploit anyone. They weren't trying to control. They were trying to help. They saw someone struggling to anchor themselves, struggling to feel capable, struggling to feel seen, struggling. And hope is intoxicating when you're afraid of losing someone. So the idea of working together, of collaborating on a film, felt like a breakthrough, a bridge, a way to turn chaos into meaning. But here's the danger no one wants to admit. When you tie healing to success, you turn love into a performance. And performance is the one thing someone with identity struggles can't survive for long. Because if healing depends on how well you do, failure stops being feedback. It becomes proof of worthlessness. That's the trap. Now imagine being the person at the center of that project. You're told this will help you find purpose. You're told this will build confidence. You're told this is your chance. But you hear something else. This is your test. Prove you belong. Prove you're capable. Prove you're not the disappointment you fear you are. That's not motivation. That's terror dressed up as opportunity. Let's talk about expectations again. In healthy collaboration, effort and outcome are separate from identity. You can fail at a project and still feel valued. But in this case, the lines were blurred. Family and work, love and evaluation, support and scrutiny. Everything overlapped. And when everything overlaps, there's nowhere to rest. Now ask yourself something. Have you ever taken on a project hoping it would fix something broken inside you? Have you ever believed, if I just succeed here, everything else will fall into place? That belief feels empowering at first, until it isn't. Because if the project struggles, or if your contribution feels inadequate, the collapse isn't contained. It spreads. And that's what made this situation volatile. The film wasn't just a job. It was a symbol, a referendum on identity, a stand-in for years of unresolved questions. Who am I without my family? Who am I inside it? Am I valued for who I am, or what I can produce? Those questions don't stay theoretical. They surface under pressure. Now consider Rob's position. He wasn't just a father. He was a professional with standards, with expectations shaped by decades of success. And even when parents try to separate those roles, the separation is never complete. A note meant as guidance can sound like judgment. A suggestion can feel like criticism. Silence can feel like disappointment, especially when the stakes feel existential. This is where guilt comes roaring back. Because Rob and Michelle reportedly carried guilt long before the film. Guilt that the shadow was too long. Guilt that success came at a cost. Guilt that love hadn't been enough to stabilize things. So the film became more than collaboration. It became atonement. A way to say, we're here. We believe in you. We'll do this together. But guilt-driven help often overreaches. It tries to solve too much at once. It loads a single moment with expectations it can't bear. And when that moment cracks, everything cracks with it. Let's talk about the aftermath. Because even if the project was completed, the internal dynamics didn't magically resolve. Creative work can amplify emotions. It brings insecurities to the surface. It forces confrontation with limitations. And for someone already struggling with identity, those confrontations don't feel constructive. They feel exposing. Now imagine finishing a project that was supposed to heal you, and realizing you still feel lost, still angry, still uncertain. That realization doesn't produce gratitude. It produces despair. Because if this didn't work, what will? This is where bitterness can quietly take root. Not just toward the project, but toward the people who believed in it. Because belief, when it fails to deliver relief, starts to feel like pressure. You begin to resent the hope others place in you. Because it highlights the gap between who they think you can be and who you feel you are. That gap hurts. And pain looks for somewhere to go. Sometimes it turns inward, sometimes outward, sometimes both. Now zoom out again. From the outside, the film is later described as a generous gesture, proof of parental support. And it was. But generosity doesn't cancel consequences, especially unintended ones. Because by tying support to performance, the family unknowingly raised the stakes. Success became obligation. Failure became confirmation. And the space to simply exist, to struggle without evaluation, shrunk. Here's the cruel irony. The more they tried to help, the less room there was for vulnerability. Because vulnerability requires the option to fail safely. And nothing about this situation felt safe. Not emotionally, not psychologically. This is where silence returns. Hard conversations get postponed again. We'll see how this plays out. Let's give it time. It'll settle. Time becomes the strategy. But time doesn't heal pressure. It compounds it. And once compounded, release becomes explosive. This chapter isn't about blaming a film. It's about understanding how hope, when overburdened, can collapse into disappointment, and how disappointment, when unspoken, turns into resentment. Resentment doesn't always announce itself. It waits. It gathers evidence. It reframes every interaction through suspicion. And suspicion corrodes trust. Now think about what that does to a household. Tension without articulation. Concern without clarity. Love without boundaries. Everyone senses something is wrong. No one agrees on what. And the longer that state persists, the more unstable it becomes. This is where outside warnings matter most. Because insiders are too close. They're emotionally invested. They're afraid of making the wrong move. So when someone from the outside, someone like Mel, voices concern, it carries weight. But concern alone isn't a plan. And without a plan, warnings become echoes. They linger. They haunt. But they don't change behavior. By the end of this chapter, one thing becomes clear. The film wasn't the turning point everyone hoped it would be. It didn't resolve identity struggles. It didn't dissolve resentment. It didn't eliminate pressure. If anything, it clarified how deep the issues ran. Because when a carefully crafted intervention fails to deliver peace, the problem isn't effort. It's structure. And the structure here, legacy, guilt, expectation, silence, remained intact. As we move into the next chapter, the setting shifts. Away from creative collaboration, toward physical proximity. A house that symbolized success. A guest house that symbolized distance. And a living arrangement that blurred boundaries even further. Because sometimes, being close isn't connection. Sometimes, it's friction. And when friction builds without release, heat follows. But what came next would show how proximity can intensify everything. And why the place meant to provide stability quietly became part of the problem itself. What if the most dangerous thing wasn't distance, but closeness without boundaries? Because that's what this chapter is really about. Not a building, not an address, not even a home in the traditional sense, but proximity. The kind that feels supportive on paper and destabilizing in real life. The kind that blurs lines instead of clarifying them. The kind that convinces everyone they're together, while quietly pulling them apart. Let's start with the setting. A large, beautiful estate. A symbol of success. A symbol of stability. A symbol of everything that had been built over decades. From the outside, it represented arrival. From the inside, it represented something else entirely. Because attached to that home, near enough to feel included, far enough to feel separate, was a guest house. And guest houses carry symbolism whether anyone intends them to or not. They say, you're close, but not quite inside. They say, you're welcome, but not fully integrated. They say, you belong conditionally. For someone already struggling with identity, that conditional belonging can be devastating. Now, to be clear, proximity like this often begins with good intentions. Safety, support, availability. It's a way of saying, we're here if you need us. But proximity without structure doesn't automatically create connection. Sometimes it amplifies tension. Because when emotional boundaries are unclear, physical closeness becomes pressure. Every interaction feels loaded. Every silence feels meaningful. Every small disagreement feels like a referendum on everything else. This is where things start to feel unstable. Because distance allows people to cool off. Proximity forces unresolved issues to coexist. And unresolved issues don't coexist peacefully. They grind. Now imagine living close enough that independence feels performative. You're technically on your own, but not really. You can be seen, heard, judged, intentionally or not. And if you already feel like you're being evaluated, that awareness never shuts off. It becomes internalized surveillance. Every move feels observed. Every choice feels symbolic. That kind of environment doesn't calm someone down. It heightens anxiety. It intensifies resentment. And resentment loves proximity. Because it feeds on comparison. Who's inside the main house? Who isn't? Who's thriving? Who's struggling? Those questions don't need answers to do damage. They just need time. Now let's look at it from the parents' side. Rob and Michelle likely saw the guest house as a compromise. Space without abandonment. Support without suffocation. A way to stay connected while respecting autonomy. But autonomy isn't about distance alone. It's about clarity. And clarity was missing. What were the expectations? How long would this arrangement last? What did independence actually mean here? Those questions remained unanswered. And unanswered questions create emotional fog. In fog, people fill in the blanks with fear. Fear of being unwanted. Fear of being controlled. Fear of being judged. Now consider how this plays into existing dynamics. Guilt was already present. Hope was already strained. Silence was already habitual. Proximity didn't resolve any of that. It magnified it. Because now, every problem was visible, but not addressable. You could see each other, but you couldn't reach each other. That's one of the cruelest forms of isolation. Being close enough to feel excluded. Now pause for a moment. Think about your own life. Have you ever lived close to someone you had unresolved tension with? Where distance would have offered relief, but closeness kept reopening wounds. That's the psychological terrain here. And it's dangerous. Because when people feel trapped between dependence and rejection, their behavior becomes unpredictable. They test limits. They provoke reactions. They oscillate between wanting closeness and pushing it away. This oscillation exhausts everyone. Parents start walking on eggshells. They don't know when to intervene and when to step back. Every decision feels loaded with risk. If we push too hard, we'll lose him. If we don't push at all, things could get worse. That uncertainty paralyzes action. And paralysis allows patterns to deepen. Now let's talk about routine. Daily life inside this arrangement likely appeared normal on the surface. Meals, conversations, check-ins. But beneath that routine, tension simmered. Because routine without resolution becomes ritualized avoidance. You talk about safe things. You avoid hard topics. You tell yourself peace equals progress. But peace built on avoidance is fragile. It cracks under stress. And stress doesn't announce itself politely. It arrives in waves. Mood shifts. Arguments that seem disproportionate. Silences that stretch too long. From the outside, it looks like nothing. From the inside, it feels like walking through a house where every floorboard creaks. You never know which step will trigger a reaction. This is where warnings start to make sense. Because someone observing from the outside, someone like Mel, wouldn't just see events. He'd sense atmosphere. An atmosphere tells you more than any single incident ever could. An atmosphere of tension, of waiting, of unresolved pressure. Atmospheres don't stay contained. They affect behavior. They shape decisions. They erode patience. And when patience erodes, reactions sharpen. Now let's return to the idea of control. For someone struggling with identity, control becomes a substitute for certainty. If you can't control who you are, you try to control your environment, your schedule, your space, your reactions. But proximity undermines control because you're never fully alone, and that can trigger defensiveness. Small requests feel intrusive. Concern feels accusatory. Support feels conditional. Now add to that the idea of being watched, not intentionally, but implicitly. Living close to family in a state of dependency can feel like constant evaluation. Are they judging me? Are they disappointed? Are they waiting for me to fail? Those questions loop endlessly, and loops are dangerous because they create narratives that harden into belief. Belief drives behavior, and behavior, once set, becomes difficult to interrupt. This is why living arrangements matter so much in volatile situations. They're not neutral. They're emotional frameworks. They either de-escalate or they intensify. And in this story, proximity intensified everything. Now think about the guest house as metaphor. Not fully inside, not fully outside. Suspended. Suspension feels temporary. But when temporary becomes indefinite, it breeds resentment. How long am I supposed to live like this? What does progress even look like? Those questions weren't answered. They hovered. And hovering questions don't stay polite. They grow teeth. By this point in the story, several things were happening simultaneously. Identity remained unresolved. Entitlement narratives hardened. Guilt deepened. Hope narrowed. And the living arrangement, instead of stabilizing the situation, became part of the pressure system. No one intended that. But intention doesn't neutralize impact. This chapter isn't about blaming proximity. It's about recognizing how environment interacts with emotional instability. Because when instability meets constant exposure, escalation becomes more likely. Not inevitable, but possible. And possibility is all tension needs. As we close this chapter, there's an unsettling realization. Everyone believed they were buying time. Time to heal. Time to figure things out. Time for things to settle. But time inside an unstable system doesn't settle anything. It compounds, and compounded pressure eventually demands release. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about the night when that pressure could no longer stay contained. Not in graphic detail, not in sensationalism, but in consequence. Because what happened wasn't just the result of one decision. It was the collision point of years of unresolved dynamics. And once a collision happens, there's no rewinding. But what came next would show how quickly quiet tension can transform into irreversible reality, and why the warning that once felt abstract suddenly felt terrifyingly specific. The night everything changed. Target length, 2,000 plus words. What if the moment everyone remembers wasn't the beginning, but the end of a story that had already been unfolding for years? Because nights like this don't come out of nowhere. They arrive after silence has done its damage, after tension has learned how to live indoors, after everyone involved has convinced themselves that tomorrow will be calmer. Tonight wasn't loud at first. It wasn't cinematic. It didn't announce itself with drama. It began the way many irreversible nights do. Quietly. Think about that for a second. Most people imagine tragedy as sudden chaos. But more often, it begins with ordinary routines. Familiar spaces. Predictable patterns. A sense that nothing particularly dangerous is happening. That illusion is powerful. And it's why warning signs get ignored right up until the moment they can't be. This night followed that pattern. No alarms. No final arguments echoing through hallways. No clear signal that something had crossed a line. Just a pressure system that had reached its breaking point. And pressure systems don't explode on schedule. They rupture when containment fails. Now pause here. Ask yourself something honestly. How many times have you felt tension in a room and told yourself it would pass? How many times have you sensed something wasn't right, but couldn't justify sounding the alarm? That hesitation is human, but it's also where danger hides. Because tension doesn't need permission to escalate. It only needs opportunity. Let's talk about the atmosphere. By this point, the household wasn't calm. It was restrained. There's a difference. Calm has ease. Restraint has effort. You can feel restraint in the way people speak carefully, in the way conversations stay shallow, in the way everyone avoids certain topics like stepping around broken glass. That was the emotional climate leading into this night. Everyone knew something was off. No one agreed on what to do about it. So the default became endurance. Just get through tonight. Just keep things stable. Just avoid conflict. But stability built on avoidance is fragile. And fragile systems fail under stress. Now imagine stress entering that environment. Not as an explosion, but as a trigger. Something small. Something ordinary. Something that wouldn't matter in a healthier system. A misunderstanding. A comment taken the wrong way. A feeling of being dismissed or challenged. In a stable environment, that moment would pass. In this environment, it became the match. This is where it's important to be precise. This story isn't about a single action. It's about accumulation. Years of identity struggle. Years of resentment. Years of blurred boundaries. Years of guilt replacing limits. All of that converged here. And convergence doesn't look dramatic until after the fact. At the time, it feels confusing, disorienting. People later describe moments like this as unreal, as if they were watching themselves from the outside, as if time slowed down. That's what happens when the brain is overwhelmed. It's not calculating consequences. It's reacting. And reactions don't care about legacy. They don't care about love. They don't care about how things are supposed to end. They care about release. Now think about what release means in this context. Release from pressure. Release from expectation. Release from identity confusion. Release from feeling trapped. Release doesn't have a moral compass. It just wants out. And when release finds a path, everything changes. This is where people often ask the wrong question. They ask, how could this happen? But the better question is, how long was this building? Because if you focus only on the night itself, you miss the warning signs. You miss the choices that narrowed options. You miss the moments where intervention might have altered the trajectory. This night wasn't a decision point. It was an outcome. And outcomes don't negotiate. Now let's talk about aftermath. Because what follows a rupture like this is not clarity. It's shock, confusion, disbelief. The kind of disbelief that makes people repeat the same sentence over and over. This can't be real. This doesn't make sense. This wasn't supposed to happen. Those thoughts are universal. They don't indicate guilt or innocence. They indicate trauma. Trauma fractures time. It separates before and after so completely that the two feel unrelated. And in the immediate aftermath, no one understands what there